So first up, I guess, we have Lachlan Blackhall. He's the co-founder and CTO of Reposit Power, and the talk is called Learn You a Flask. Please welcome him.
Oh, good morning, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the conference thus far, and I hope you have a productive day today. So I've blatantly stolen the wording of the title from the Haskell thing because I think it's an awesome, I love their tutorial, but there'll be nothing actually Haskell related in this talk. It's going to strictly stick to Flask. And hopefully some of you may one day get wisdom and wealth from using Flask, but for the time being I found that not to be the case. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a co-founder of a company called Reposit Power. We're based in the ACT. We write software to control energy storage in the grid. So we don't build batteries, but we build the software that tells them what to do intelligently and trade software in the market. So you can see one of the battery that's under our control and some of our customers, and this is an app, one of the apps that we have. So I show you this only to demonstrate the fact that we use Flask a lot in our infrastructure. So sort of perhaps contrary to popular opinion sometimes, Flask is actually production ready, and it's really, for us it's really quite useful. Very, very simple to get started with. So anyone who's come across Flask before, you've probably seen this. You get onto the Flask website, and it tells you it's a micro framework for Python. Now the thing is that I feel that there's this huge animosity between the Flask community and the Django community, and I suppose what I'd like to say is that there's absolutely no reason for that to exist at all. So we actually use both Flask and Django in our infrastructure, and they're useful for very, very different things. This talk is not about trying to migrate people away from Django. It's basically to give you an introduction to how you can do things with Flask. So this is the typical Hello World example that Flask provides you, and I find in general this is not a criticism of documentation or of Flask, but typically you see this, and then they always basically say, from this you can build anything you want, but that's left as an exercise for the reader. And to be honest, when I first sort of saw Flask and you get this up and running, you're like, oh cool, this is amazing. I can get something working in 30 seconds, think how much I'm going to be able to get working after that. And then you run into that wall all of a sudden where you're like, oh well, this is awesome. I've got this really capable tool and it's going to be able to do all these things for me, but I actually don't know how it's going to do any of these things for me. So the talk today is really to walk you through a very simple application that I built precisely for the conference. So I should say I'm not a front-end designer, so the actual UI component is absolutely terrible. I'll leave you to judge whether the back-end component's also terrible. But really, the goal is at the end of the day, you can walk away understanding not only how Flask works in the first 30 seconds you touch it, but what you can actually do with some of the other extensions and plugins that are available for it, and how you might use that to actually scaffold an app of reasonable size. And it's probably also worth noting that Flask is actually, it's gone from being, well, it was actually a practical joke initially. It was supposed to be, it's a practical joke play on bottle, and so Flask was what they called it, but it's actually growing into a community where you're actually getting capabilities to build much, much bigger apps. So, it's heading towards offering some of the features that Django is more well known for. And anecdotally, what I've found is that you tend to start building with Flask, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I wish I had this capability, so you build out a module for this, and it rapidly starts to look like a lot like what's already been built in the Django community. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to talk about Flask, I'm going to talk about the plugins and the extensions that are available. I've built this awesome app, which is beautiful in its monochrome glory, and it's up and running at the moment. And I'm going to just sort of walk you through the code, show you what plugins there are, how you integrate them, how you build an app around it, and then finally how you put it onto Heroku. I'm going to resist the temptation to do this all as a live demo. However, I'd be quite happy to walk anyone through it, and if you jump on GitHub, the code is already there and there's full instructions, so you should actually be able to spin it up by following those instructions, I hope. So the thing that probably differentiates Flask from Django, not that they need to be compared, is that Flask in its core, the core repository, actually doesn't provide many capabilities simply beyond serving requests, which is awesome for lots of reasons, because when you start, it makes it really easy to understand what the server's actually doing. So you can see what HTTP verbs are coming in, and then you can respond appropriately. So that's awesome when you're first starting off, but pretty rapidly, to actually do anything useful with it, you want to start using some of the plugins. So the plugins that are available on this Flask extensions page, which you can see up there. There's probably hundreds, I'd say now. Of those hundreds, there's probably half a dozen to a dozen that are sort of broadly considered to be core plugins that are well tested against. So the ones that we're going to look at today are Flask SQL Alchemy, Flask Admin, Flask Stormpath, which is a commercial provider, but it basically wraps Flask Logging, which is a community extension, and Flask What the Form for forms. So the plugin page is an awesome place to start, though, if you're actually looking for capabilities to include in your app. So the first thing I suppose I'd like to say about Flask is that the fact that you can make an app in a single piece of code does not mean you should make an app in a single piece of code. I find it really amusing how often people go, oh, cool, this is a really simple library, therefore I can build humongously large apps in a single page because I can. And my strong advice would be not to move down that path. If you want to do a hello world, it's fine to have everything in one file. But here, Flask and programmers more generally can learn a lot from how MVC frameworks do things by actually structuring your code well, because you'll find that the clarity that comes from structuring it well actually means you can build much, much larger projects and keep track of it. So I'm going to now switch across to the code. So I apologize for the resolution here. The code will be fine. I'll just quickly walk you through the structure, which is going to be tiny. And I'm sorry, I don't think I can make it any bigger. So this is the exact structure that's in the code on GitHub. So I tend to like, you have a top-level folder for your app. Underneath it, I tend to like to break it up into models for your data, controllers for your controllers, and typically templates for your views. So the templates are in templates. So the views are in templates, and then a whole bunch of static files are in static. Underneath that, there's typically an init, which is this file here, and I'll walk you through this. The init tends to be the easiest way to set up all of your plugins and actually provide a grounding for the app. Separate settings file. There is an SQLite database here, but it actually uses Postgres in production, and I'll show you how you can use SQLite for local development and then Postgres seamlessly for production, which is actually really cool. And then I tend to have a separate scripts folder, which actually makes it easier to get across into Heroku, because at some point you need to expose the scripts that actually get run there. So there's the initdb should be pretty self-explanatory. It actually creates your database for the first time, and then a run Flask app for running locally. And then the proc file that's there is the definition for Heroku. All right. So first things first, actually setting up. It really is as simple, setting it up is as simple as they say on the web page. You're importing it, you're setting up your Flask name. One thing that they don't tend to really push as much as they probably should is that you actually really do need a secret key for setting it up. If you want to do anything with forms and to get CSRF protection and things like that, you have to do this. So I would always encourage you to do this. All that we're importing is just an os.random string to do it. So it's really easy to set up, but it's a really important part of setting it up early. I tend to make sure that we've got logging. You do actually have logging within Flask if you want to use it there. Once you've set up Flask, I think it's the best way to actually structure the app is just to bring in all of your extensions here. Now, you actually don't need to use the specific Flask extensions for a lot of these. So you can actually bring in SQL Alchemy, which is a beautiful ORM, as SQL Alchemy. The beauty of using the extensions is that somebody's actually put the time and effort into getting those extensions to play nicely in a web-based environment. So particularly SQL Alchemy, the way they handle the scope of the connections and things like that and the sessions, someone spent a lot of time thinking about it and they've got it right. So just use Flask SQL Alchemy. Don't actually try and roll it yourself. So setting up the database, so setting up access to the database is what we do first. So Flask uses a really simple config structure. And so app.config is a dictionary, and it just contains keys and values, and every extension writes its values there and reads from the configuration there. So it's nice and easy, typically well documented for all of the extensions and for Flask itself. So here we're just going to bring in, I'll scroll across, we're going to bring in the database URL from settings. So the way I tend to do the database URL is this. So using environment variables is obviously a hugely useful way to do config. But for something like actually migrating it onto Heroku eventually, it's a necessity because your production database will end up being exposed through this parameter. That said, I don't want to set up Postgres on my local machine to do testing. In fact, one huge downside of running a Mac is that setting up Postgres on your Mac is actually nightmarishly difficult for what it is. So I tend to just create a basic SQLite database that I use locally. So you get most of the features you need. It's really, really easy to test, but you don't have to worry about anything beyond that. I'll come back to these in a minute, but they're related to authentication. So we set up the extension, we initialize the DB object, and for historical reasons, myself, I tend to put into a DB session. So that's your session object that you can now use for all of your database access throughout your app. So I've heard a couple of talks where people have sort of noted the difficulty of dealing with database access in Flask and more generally. I can't emphasize how good SQL Alchemy is. Some of my colleagues are here and they've heard me rant about it before at work, but SQL Alchemy has a slightly steeper learning curve than many things. It's this incredible piece of software that's been built up over the last 10 years, and they've actually just got to version 1, so they now just consider it release ready, but it's phenomenal in what it can do. It works with all of the database engines you would expect it to work with. It's really, really simple to set up models, which I'll show you in a minute. But that initial learning curve steers people away from it to the point where they're like, it's fine, I'm just going to use raw SQL to access my database. Do not. There is no excuse for using raw SQL. We're Python programmers. We like working high up the stack. We should access our databases way up the stack and do it through an ORM. So learn SQL Alchemy if you want to access a database, because it's, in my opinion, the one true path to accessing databases. If you don't like it, there are other ORMs available, but please don't resort to using raw SQL. It's just far more painful than it should be. The next thing we're going to do is, it's nice to have a bit of CRUD access to your database, especially when you're tinkering. Flask has this really nice admin plugin that actually works with SQL Alchemy. So you can actually define your models, and then you can go and add and add, delete, edit data in your database, which is kind of cool. And you can actually visualize it from your app, which is even better. The next thing we're adding is authentication and user management. I'm not promoting using commercial products. You don't need to. But my view is that user security is hugely important, and often I'd prefer somebody who was doing that as their full-time job or managing those problems. So Flask Stormpath is an extension that allows you to use the Stormpath service. It's free to get started on, but obviously they've worked out how to make their pound of flesh. So, but it does work really, really well. And actually, these 4 lines of configuration get you not just integration into into Stormpath, but also all of your login screens for free, which I think is kind of cool to get started with. You don't have to worry about any of that. It's based on the Flask Login plugin, which itself is actually really, really useful. So I'd encourage checking it out. So that's how we set up, that's how I typically set up an application. It keeps it nice and well structured. And then the last thing you do in it is you actually import the roots. And so these are just the endpoints that your app actually responds to, which for those of you who know Flask, you can define elsewhere. So this is naughty, I know, but it's convenient shorthand. So once you've sort of set up your app like that, you're good to go. You can start working with your database and defining your roots and everything else. So the first thing I'd like to just show you briefly to re-emphasize why you should use SQL Alchemy is how you actually set up your database. So SQL Alchemy defines all of the things that you're going to need in your database and allows you to define your objects declaratively. So I tend to just pull out these mappings here, but only just for clarity's sake. You don't obviously need to. But let's actually have a look at the data model that we're going to use here. So we have some users. They'll have an ID in the database, a remote ID, which corresponds to the unique account in Stormpath. I'll explain why I do this, because it's not strictly required, but I find it makes relational access easier on your device, in your project. This is a slightly more advanced capability of SQL Alchemy, but you can add mix-ins to your data models. So for doing authorization of what you're actually allowed to do, having a hasAuthor mix-in means that you can now actually say who owns the record quite easily. So this is how you set it up. The decorator at declared attra is, it just delays actually setting setting these attributes in the class until runtime. So it's really just the way that SQL Alchemy sets up the model isn't particularly amenable to adding things dynamically, and this is how you add things dynamically. So whenever we use the hasAuthor model, mix-in, sorry, as in to-do, so to-do hasAuthor. So in the to-do, you'll have the to-do itself, a description of the to-do, and then you'll also actually map it to an author as well. So you'll know who owns it. So when we actually get into to doing permissions, we've actually got something we can do permissions against. So for this reason, and I think this is actually pretty simple, for this reason, this is why I like using SQL Alchemy. Right? It's very, very clear what your models are. You've got full control of it in here within your app. I haven't done it in this app, but there's another awesome extension called Flask Migrate. So Flask Migrate wraps Alembic, which is a database migration tool, and it is phenomenal. It allows you to, keep track of what's going on in your database, and as you change your model, you can update the database. My one gripe with it is that Alembic still doesn't understand how to do enums in Postgres, and so if you are trying to do an enum in your database model, you have to add a few lines of code. And if you ever run into the problem, please feel free to contact me, because I finally worked out how to do it, and so I now know the actual recipe for it. But apart from that, Flask Migrate is really, really, really cool. So the other thing I tend to do in terms of sort of scaffolding up a project is that you've now got your objects for your model, so your database model's fine. But typically, you want to, like the beauty of having access to a database is that you get transactions and things like that. I tend to find that you actually want to wrap accessing the database through some other services. So I have written a very, very simple data service model that allows you to create objects, edit objects, allows you to delete them, check if they exist, get one and get many. This is probably the longest file in the entire app. I'm not saying that you should always do it this way, but I find that if you want to access your database cleanly, wrapping everything in, like, these things like rollbacks. If you have exceptions when you're trying to do inserts and updates, just keeps everything nice and clean. So I find this is a nice, convenient way to keep track of, or to actually access your data. The other thing I've put in here is very, very simple permission access to the data. So you can, based on the author, which we put in the model, you can determine whether someone actually has the right to access the data, to delete it, to edit it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's basically the database. So SQL Alchemy takes care of all your connections based on your database URL. You don't have to worry about that anymore. You have these services which you can instantiate it when you need to access data. So the thing that Flask Admin, which I talked about, actually then allows you to see what your data looks like. So I'm sorry to the videographers, I'm going to switch again and actually show you this app. So this is the app actually running on Heroku. So as I said, it's an awesome to-do app. It allows you to put to-dos and descriptions in. It has login and whatnot. But it has admin as well. Just while it's spinning up. All right, so Flask Admin now gives you access to your database just to do CRUD stuff. So you can actually see what's in there. So you can see the to-dos that are there. You can see the users that have registered, et cetera, et cetera. So this is currently unsecured. So don't ever put admin on a server and don't put it behind authentication. I'm showing you how to do this, but please don't ever do this in production. It would be insane because there's no permissions at all on this. I find admin is just a really cool way to be able to see when you're programmatically adding data through your app. It's a really cool way to see what data is actually getting in there. So I'm now just going to talk about the routes that we have in the model. So there's a few little things I do which are just more convenience for Flask rather than anything else. I've got this notifications object which just allows you to add messages which come up on the app. I encourage you to have a look at it. It's not particularly amazing practice to do it, but it does make it easy to pass notifications in and then use them within the templates. I have a simple index page. So this is just directly serving up a template. But then we start to get into the more interesting aspect, I think, where we are doing things with the data. So we have a root / to-do, and this basically just brings up a list of the to-dos. So the interesting thing you saw there is you saw that I had to log in. All right, so this is the to-do. This is the list view that we're talking about. But you saw I had to log in when I get there, and the reason I had to log in is because of this @login_required decorator. @login_required is provided by Flask Login, so it's provided by Flask by Flask Stormpath. That's all you have to do. That's the only addition you have to make in your Flask code to get authentication once you've added the plugin, and that's awesome. Like, the capabilities there, I think are fantastic. In the to-do list, there's nothing we do that's really special. We use one of this to-do service, which is just the data service I showed you before. We get many with permissions, which basically means we're just getting the stuff that you're able to get, and then we send it through to the render template. All right, and then the templates just use I'm not going to walk you through Ginger 2, which is the templating language. You can grab the code and have a look at it yourself. But the to-dos just, you pass in variables, and then Ginger can use them to generate HTML before it sends them back to users. The other routes we have are add, edit, delete, etc. Again, they don't do anything particularly amazing, but I think they give a good demonstration of how you can actually use Flask to get data from your database and send it back to your users. The one thing that's worth pointing out here, and I'll do it just above, is that forms are always a challenging one, and there's lots of different packages out there that do them. For Flask, the de facto approach is to use something called WhatTheForm. So WhatTheForm allows you to define really, really simple models, simple forms, like so, and then you can instantiate them and send them on to your templates. All right, so the nice thing about here is you get a structured way to actually generate your forms, and perhaps the more useful part is that when you're actually editing something, you can actually load an object from your database and insert it into the form, so that when the form renders on the web page, it contains all of the data from the database that you're editing. So it pre-populates forms, and it's one line. It's really, really simple to do. I'm getting close. So anyway, so this allows you to get data, to process it, to put it into a template, and then obviously to render it to your users. The last thing I'd just like to show you quickly is the part about getting it onto Heroku. So Heroku itself used to be more awesome than it currently is, I find. They've just changed their pricing structure, and you used to be able to get a free dyno permanently. They now have these hobby dynos, which are hobbled. So they give you 16 hours of runtime each day, but then they sleep. So they used to be awesome for having long-running worker processes, but you can no longer do that, which is a shame. But that said, I still like Heroku because it is really, really simple to interact with. So the proc file for Heroku is as simple as this. And what this says is that you're going to have a web worker, which is going to run this command. It's going to call Flask app, which is a WSGI app running Unicorn. The other one we define is this initdb script. So it basically allows you to easily run that to actually create your database. Perhaps more useful if you actually want to use this repo to actually get something up and running is I've actually written a README, which my colleagues will know is actually quite rare for me. So these are the instructions you'll need to deploy locally, and these are step-by-step instructions for deploying to Heroku. All right, so I'd encourage you, I've tested this a number of times, so until Heroku changes the command structure again, which they periodically do, this will work. It's actually really, really quite simple to upload to Heroku. The complexity is just sometimes just defining the proc file. The last thing I'd like to just warn you about, and this one was a hard one lesson. In your requirements.txt, which you need when you upload, you don't need to, you need to define the packages that you're using, and it's pretty simple. Flask, Flask admin, et cetera, et cetera. Flask has signaling, which you'll see if you look at how the authentication's done, and nowhere does it tell you actually need to install Blinker. It alludes to it, but just install Blinker. It's an app. It's a package that does operating system level messaging. You just need to install it, or you can't get any of the signal handling that Flask provides. The bottom two you need specifically for running on Heroku. Psychop G2 is the driver for PostgreSQL. And obviously, if your proc file defines Unicorn, you actually need to have Unicorn so that you can actually run it. I spent a fair amount of time actually trying to figure that one out the first time I ever used Heroku. Sorry, I'm winding up, I swear. In the slides, which I'll make available after the talk, I've added a couple of other resources. This is the main Flask homepage. It's really good. There's a really great mega tutorial by Miguel Grinberg. I'd recommend checking it out. The only challenge with it is that when it was accurate at the time of writing, but some of the Heroku commands have changed in the interim. So I would recommend using the README that I provide in this as the current way of interacting with Heroku. But it's still a great tutorial. Thank you very much.